Hello, I'm John Coleman, and thank you for watching this presentation, which I've titled, There Is No Significant Global Warming. Now, I think you and I have this in common. We both love this planet Earth, and we think it's our highest responsibility as citizens of this planet to protect it from any damage as a result of our lives here. Now we are being told that we are causing global warming, and that global warming is doing exactly that, making planet Earth unlivable. That's a very serious matter. The name of the crisis has been changed a lot, but the charge remains the same. We are destroying planet Earth. No matter what they call it, the entire basis of the crisis as they see it is this: the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere from the exhaust of our cars and airplanes, our power plants, our factories, everything that burns fossil fuels. This is it. Their entire scientific case is built on the greenhouse effect, that they say skyrockets from the increasing amount of CO2, carbon dioxide, in the atmosphere. Now let me make something very clear, here and now. If they were correct, in fact, if there was any reasonable chance that they were on target, I would devote the balance of my life to working to stop the emission of carbon dioxide into the air. But I have seriously studied the science behind their claims, and I find their claims to be entirely wrong. I am totally convinced that there is no significant man-made global warming. This is an amazing and very upsetting case of science gone bad. How can something like this happen? Well, I'm going to try to explain it as clearly and completely as I can. But here's where all of this gets really messy. Environmentalists and politicians have adopted the global warming frenzy to advance their agendas, and they use it to promote their solutions to global warming, alternate energy, and a change to a less industrialized civilization. And so they say that I am just a Republican, that I'm picking on their hero, Al Gore, and that undoubtedly I'm on the payroll of big oil. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friend, my interest is not political. I am not being paid by big oil or anybody else to campaign against this global warming frenzy. I'm just a longtime meteorologist, and I am very upset about my science being destroyed by a myth. I'm upset in response to these totally false scientific claims. The global warming advocates are trying to turn off the lights on our civilization, an advanced way of life that's the product of 2,000 years of solid science and engineering and hard work by all those before us. The global warming crowd wants to shut down our automobiles, no more taking the kids to school in the SUV, and they want to ground our airplanes, no more flights to Hawaii. And they want to shut down the factories that make our computers and our iPods and our iPhones and all that other neat stuff that makes life good. I do not want to turn off our fossil fuel-powered civilization to save us from the global warming crisis, and here is why. There is no crisis. But let me add, I am for clean alternate energy. I wish I had better news about that. The truth is that alternate energy is not yet up to the task of powering this civilization. We're going to have to depend on fossil fuels and the internal combustion engine for another 30 to 50 years. And by the way, the internal combustion engine is one of mankind's greatest inventions. Well, here's the good news. We can continue to live as we are today while we develop new energy sources and new engines. We can do it just fine because we are not causing climate change by using fossil fuels. And please, don't worry about the polar bears. They are not endangered from global warming. That whole polar bears are dying campaign was simply a disgusting scare tactic. And the same is true for the polar ice. Our use of fossil fuels is not causing it to melt. And anyone who has lived on the coast for the last few decades knows that the claim about rising ocean water levels is also without merit. And more than that, those claims of record-high worldwide temperature averages are based on cooked-up data. There is no warming problem. So tell me, just what sort of temperature do you want for planet Earth? You want 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s? And how about the rainfall? Do you want a lot? Or would you like it to be drier and sunnier? Well, I think you and I can agree on this one. We want a natural climate, unaltered by the activities of our civilization. But there is something very important that you need to understand. The natural climate is not something that you can depend on. In fact, the climate of Earth has been anything but steady over time. Here's a chart. It goes back 400,000 years, and it shows how Earth has wildly vacillated between ice ages and what we call interglacial periods every 100,000 years or so. So which of these do you want? Well, obviously we don't want either. We don't want an Earth covered by a thick coating of ice or a monstrous heat wave. But there are big swings in climate even during these interglacial periods. Look at the ups and downs since the last ice age ended about 12,000 years ago. Several natural instances of global warming and several mini ice ages. Well, I think we can agree we would prefer the in-between, what we call normal climate. But we can't count on it. Even in the last 1,000 years, Earth has experienced both significant natural warm-ups and natural cold periods. And these swings had major impacts on the activities of mankind, including that warm 300 years when the Norsemen were farming and raising grapes even on Greenland, which is now totally covered by ice. So we crave a steady medium climate. It seems we shouldn't expect that to last for too many generations. We can just count ourselves very lucky that we have it for our lives. And just look at the natural swings in temperature over the last 1,000 years here. I want to ask you a question about this. How can we accept that those swings in temperature in the pre-fossil fuel centuries were natural, but that the increases of the last 100 years are the result of our release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? According to Al Gore and his friends, this chart proves the case for global warming. It shows the average temperature of Earth has risen since we've been using fossil fuels to power our civilization, releasing carbon dioxide exhaust into the atmosphere. The much ballyhooed increase is a whopping 1.5 degrees or so, maybe a little less, in the last 131 years. So if you look carefully, there's a 30-year period here where the CO2 increases, but the temperature falls. Oh, and here's another one, a 40-year period in the industrial boom years following World War II, when CO2 was rising rapidly, but temperatures held steady. These deviations are really important because they clearly illustrate the disconnect between CO2 and temperature. For 70 out of the 131 years, more than half the time in the age of fossil fuels, temperatures have not risen with the increase of CO2. Let me make 2 points right here. An increase of 1.5 degrees in temperature over 131 years is not at all unusual in the long-term scheme of things and doesn't prove anything. And the second part is this. I accept without question that there has been a steady increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as a result of the burning of fossil fuels. I think that is well documented. The measurement of CO2 is good science, but it in no way proves the bad science of global warming. The CO2 has increased by about 20%, from 315 parts per million in 1958 up to 380 parts per million today. A lot of that comes from natural sources. The rest comes from fossil fuel exhaust. Science can actually identify which molecules are from the fossil fuels. Now, I need to make it absolutely clear that the increase in CO2 is accepted and not in dispute, but there is no proof of any connection between this increase and any significant increase in temperatures. And this is crucial because the entire global warming case is built on a claim of a direct connection between the CO2 and the temperature increases. So keep your eye on the ball, and you will realize that there continues to be a disconnect between CO2 and temperatures. This disconnect showed up again in the first decade of the 21st century when the CO2 continued to increase while temperatures leveled off and even fell measurably. Now let me emphasize, this recent increase in temperatures during the age of fossil fuels is not significant in the long-term picture. Temperatures have risen and fallen for natural reasons throughout history and has been warmed up many times, much warmer than it is now, numerous occasions before fossil fuels. Our ancestors did not cause the medieval optimum, nor did they cause the Little Ice Age. Unless you can prove an important connection between warming and CO2, we're not causing any problem now. The global warming frenzy peaked in the early 1990s when this chart was published. It totally eliminated all those historic fluctuations in temperature and greatly increased the modern warming. The chart became known as the hockey stick chart, and it was said to prove global warming was real and a major problem. In 1995, it was the centerpiece of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. But before long, skeptical scientists had proven that it was without merit. They showed that the formula that Dr. Michael Mann had concocted to produce this chart would produce a hockey stick-shaped chart regardless of the input data. And this was the first real indication that the scientists promoting global warming were falling short of scientific proof of their theory. Let me show you a quick example of the problem with the claim that it's never been warmer than it is now. Here in North America, the all-time temperature record was set back in the Dust Bowl days of 1934. The all-time record, South America, 1920. Australian record, 1960. Europe, 1978. But Asia, 1942. And Africa, 1922. Not a single continental high-temperature record has been set in the last 33 years, when Dr. Mann, Al Gore, and the United Nations and the National Weather Service et al. Have kept telling us that we're having the warmest years ever. Maybe we should stop for a moment and inspect the makeup of the atmosphere. It is mostly made up of nitrogen and oxygen. Water vapor, the leading greenhouse gas, makes up 1%, and CO2, carbon dioxide, is just a trace gas. 0.04%. You have to wonder how a trace gas like this could possibly have such a profound impact on temperature. Well, the global warming crowd says that CO2 is like pepper, I guess. A little bit goes a long way. And they tell us that's because of a concept which they have named radiative forcing. You would get the feeling that there must be something to it, since hundreds of scientists in the last 60 years have published hundreds of studies that either explain or support or are based on the concept of warming caused by CO2 through radiative forcing. Well, this is really important. It is a cornerstone on which is built the entire global warming theory. They contend that via radiative forcing, carbon dioxide, which makes up less than 0.5% of our atmosphere, becomes a super greenhouse gas that is responsible for unstoppable, rapid global warming that will render our planet unlivable. Now remember, the records, even as manipulated by the global warming advocate scientist, only shows a warming of less than a degree, well, maybe slightly over a degree, since 1880, and the temperature anomalies here are in tenths of a degree. But nonetheless, they are constantly bombarding us with claims that as a result of warming, the Arctic ice cap is rapidly melting and will vanish within 3 decades. And they play on our emotions by telling us, as a result, the polar bears are dying. And they frighten us by telling us rising oceans will engulf our shoreline cities and towns. They tell us warming will lead to catastrophic superstorms that will wipe out our cities and kill tens of thousands, and they imply Katrina was caused by global warming, and we haven't seen anything yet, and they tell us hundreds of thousands will starve as drought wipes out our farm crops, and they say hundreds of thousands more will die in massive heat waves. Well, the years pass, and the warnings are repeated over and over again, but none of the predictions has actually come to pass. Radiative forcing doesn't really seem to be destroying our climate at all. So what proof of their theory do they actually have? What have they produced? None. They have a vote of the climate change panel at the UN, and they have their computer models, but they programmed those models with radiative forcing and their assumptions. That doesn't make it real. The truth is that the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is dominated by politicians and bureaucrats and environmental activists, with an anti-fossil fuel and tax the rich nations to fund the one world government agenda. The scientists there, the small number, all make their living off the global warming research, and their very livelihood depends on global warming. And anyway, in science, folks, a vote is not proof. You must have factual, irrefutable evidence, and they simply don't have it. When I make this point in conversation, people usually immediately ask me about the glaciers. They are melting, people say, and that's proof of global warming. You need to understand that this is an interglacial period, and it is natural for the glaciers to be melting. It has nothing to do with the burning of fossil fuels. Much of the Earth was covered by a very deep ice sheet when the last ice age ended. The ice has melted and melted and melted, and yes, there is still ice in the form of glaciers at many locations. May I ask you, what is the natural or normal extent of the glaciers? The size they were in, let's say, year 1 A.D., the way they were in 1970, the way they are now? You see, the melting of ice is not a global warming crisis. When it is warm and the ice is melting, life of all forms on Earth thrives. Don't be panicked by scare talk. Relax and enjoy our warm period. Oh, and by the way, the Antarctic ice cap, the one at the South Pole, is near the highest point since we've been measuring it by satellite starting in the late 70s. And despite all the wild scare claims about the ice cap at the North Pole, it had melted to a low point since the satellite measurements began back in 2007. But it has been increasing ever since. Here is a chart of the North Pole and the ice there. The dip in 2007 in black shows up well, and the return of the recent normal range in subsequent years is clear. There's no big deal there. I have researched how the global warming scare got started. That makes quite a story. It all started in the mid-1950s, honestly and innocently, at this great spot, the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, California, on the north coastal edge of San Diego. A great scientist, Roger Revelle, who was the head of Scripps, hired Hans Suess, and the two collaborated to publish a research paper. That paper speculated that carbon dioxide might be a significant greenhouse gas, and they concluded that further research was needed. Their concept hit like a tidal wave, however, with bureaucrats and politicians and environmentalists, and the research dollars began to flow far and wide. Soon scientists everywhere were trying to make the case that fossil fuels were changing our climate. At Scripps, Dr. David Keeling set up the first CO2 measuring observatory out in Hawaii, and thus began the Keeling curve, now continued under the stewardship of David's son, Dr. Ralph Keeling. The global warming bandwagon was on parade throughout the climate research community, and Maurice Strong, a bureaucrat at the United Nations, took note of all of this, and he organized an international conference on climate at Stockholm, Sweden in 1972. His goal was one world government, and to fund his plan, he envisioned the developed nations being taxed for their use of fossil fuels to the benefit of the undeveloped nations, and to fund the one world government. His work led to the now much publicized United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Meanwhile, Roger Revelle had moved from Scripps to Harvard to establish a Center for Population Studies. And by happenstance, oh yes, this happenstance changed history. A student named Albert Gore signed up for one of his classes. Well, Revell used the carbon dioxide study he had done as an example of mankind's impact on the planet, and Gore had found a cause célèbre that would dominate his future life. Al Gore, who became a U.S. Senator, while running for vice president in 1992, put out his book titled Earth in the Balance. It credited Roger Revell for sounding the alarm about fossil fuels and CO2 and global warming. But by that time, Dr. Revell had become somewhat skeptical about the threat to the climate from CO2. He wrote to Congressman Tim Bates that CO2 impacted human beings in both positive and negative ways, and he cautioned Congressman Tim Worth that we should be careful not to arouse too much alarm about CO2 until the amount of warming became clearer. And then Revell joined two other scientists in authoring an article for a new science magazine called Cosmos, in which they argued, go slow on global warming because the science is not settled. But Al Gore was not listening. He dismissed Revell as senile and said that the debate was over. Global warming had become a Democrat campaign issue, and Al Gore was the spokesman for the cause. And then he wrote a second book titled An Inconvenient Truth. And then in 2002 came the movie by the same title, and the global warming scare campaign was moving at top speed. It seemed as though everyone believed. Al Gore was preaching doom and gloom to every impressionable young person in the nation. And when the newspapers, TV networks, and magazines all climbed aboard with Al Gore and the UN's IPCC, the global warming scare was in high gear. Meanwhile, the United Nations kept the global warming story rolling with a series of fancy conferences at glamorous locations around the world, where they published a continuing series of research reports. And here in the United States, the federal government was on the publicity wave with constant claims that global warming had taken control of our climate. Al Gore was on top of the world. An Inconvenient Truth won an Oscar in 2007. And then it all peaked when Al Gore and the UN IPCC were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But hardly noticed by the media, thousands of scientists were uniting to declare that the entire frenzy was based on bad science. We all knew that the claims about carbon dioxide causing out-of-control global warming were wrong, dead wrong. Also somewhat ignored by the media in the years that followed were a series of amazing conferences where global warming skeptics were invited to make their case. And at these conferences, the answer was loud and clear. There is no significant man-made global warming. They are cooking the books. The skeptical scientists named the men, many of them, who were behind these questionable global warming data and showed how their organizations were doing it. These scientists and their institutions, it seems, in my opinion, are dependent on the global warming research dollar, and they're doing what it takes to keep it rolling. It was at the Heartland Conference that important scientists who rejected the carbon dioxide global warming theory were at last given a platform to make their case. A standout among them was Fred Singer, one of the scientists who had co-authored that important Cosmos article with Roger Revell, and then had been battling the UN IPCC and the greenhouse theory for more than 30 years. And then there was this young professor, Willie Soon from Harvard, who was working to explain how the sun and other astronomical forces influence our climate changes. And the distinguished scientist from MIT, Richard Lindzen, who had produced numerous research papers debunking CO2 theory in the UN's IPCC reports. Two more heroes emerged from the University of Alabama, John Christie and Roy Spencer, who used the satellite temperature data to track the temperatures of Earth and understand their fluctuations. And these two men, Anthony Watts and Joseph D'Aleo, meteorologists who have unraveled the ways in which government sloppiness and sleight of hand with the numbers have manipulated temperatures. And how about this father and son team of scientists, the ITSOs, who have worked to explain how carbon dioxide is not only essential to life on Earth, did you hear that? Essential to life on Earth, but the increase from our civilization has actually enhanced the growth of crops and forest. And now in the last couple of years, numerous top scientists have continued to come forward as skeptics about global warming. William Happer, Hal Lewis, and Judith Curry are notables among them. Then in November of 2009, there was a leak of thousands of documents and emails from the primary climate data center in England, the East Anglia University Climate Research Unit, one of 3 primary climate data centers on Earth. And it was immediately clear that the scientists there were not being objective. The deeper we dug, the more clear it became that temperature data from East Anglia had been totally reworked to serve the needs of the global warming advocates. And collusion between the head of that English unit and the man behind that famous hockey stick chart in the U.S. came out in the email. ClimateGate was major news in much of the world, and it was all over the internet. But it was essentially ignored by the biased Big Three network newscast in the United States. In the UK, the Daily Telegraph speculated this could be the end of anthropogenic global warming. At this point, our attention turned to investigations of the weather data at the 2 primary government data centers in the United States. And at those centers, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency's National Climate Data Center and NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, data has become so commingled, it's hard to tell exactly who has led the way on the data maneuvering. Look at this. In the mid-1990s, the U.S. climate centers cut the number of temperature observation points used to produce their world temperature average from about 6,000 to 3,000. And then later they kept trimming it on down until they got down to 1,700 points. They were cutting the number of thermometers used at a time when the Internet was adding tens of thousands of temperature points online for immediate access. In the process, they eliminated all the measurements from the cooler mountain locations. They dropped many cooler rural locations in favor of city observations, which are warmed by the urban heat island effect, not CO2. And they dropped almost all of the cold polar locations. And this chart shows the predictable result. The bars are the temperatures. They skyrocketed as the number and locations of the observation points was manipulated. What a scam. And this is another chart of the same effect. Temperatures in the pink soar as the observation points in blue are cut. But you see, these changes they made did not have any impact on the readings from any individual observation points. So then they announced that they had to go back and adjust the older years' data because, well, those old thermometers produced temperatures that were too warm. So they reworked and lowered the old temperature data, which had the impact of making the more recent years relatively warmer. Even though the mainstream media didn't cover these revelations, the internet and talk radio did to some extent, and some cable channels touched on it. And voila, look at this. A Scientific American poll shows that science readers, at least, have abandoned the global warming bandwagon. But do not think for a second that the global warming issue is dead. It's not by a long shot. The power, money power, is on the other side. It's our tax money, passed out as research dollars. For 2011, at least $2.4 billion in the U.S. federal budget alone. Now follow this. The government officials send the money to research centers and environmental organizations who produce research papers for the United Nations IPCC. They pay salaries to their officials and their researchers, and those people then make political donations back to the political parties and their candidates, who are the same people, the elected officials, who make the grants. Now, please understand, I have no personal arguments with the environmental organizations. They work to protect our planet, good work. And I don't have any argument with the millions of people who support these worthwhile organizations. And I certainly support clean air, clean water, and protection of the species, and leaving Earth clean and natural for our children. But I do not like the global warming scare tactics that have been embraced, and I have a passion to overcome the bad science behind the global warming theory. The situation now has become a serious issue in our lives in these last few years as the Federal Environmental Agency sets out to regulate carbon dioxide as what they call a pollutant. In California, by the way, the state is taking even more aggressive action than federals. Now, all of this is an attack on the money in our pockets and our way of life. If these regulations go into effect, the cost of food and lights and heating and air conditioning, just hunkering down at home to get through a winter, travel, and every manufactured item we buy is going to go up, up, up. Now a dozen states, led by Virginia and Texas, are challenging the EPA ruling, but the bad science has led to bad regulation, and the scientific debate has now become a legal issue. And there are a rash of other lawsuits being filed against energy companies for environmental damage. The entire issue is moving into the courts. Al Gore and many other politicians in the UN, IPCC, and the Environmental Protection Agency say that the future of Earth is in the balance. I know that is not so, but our civilized way of life, our homes, and everything our forefathers worked to accomplish to make life good does lie in the balance. My friends, I've studied all these scientific papers. I know there is no significant man-made global warming now. There hasn't been any in the past, and there is no reason to fear any in the future. Hello, I'm John Coleman, and thank you for watching this presentation, which I've titled, There is no Significant Global Warming. Now, I think you and I have this in common. We both love this planet Earth, and we think it's our highest responsibility as citizens of this planet to protect it from any damage as a result of our lives here. Now we are being told that we are causing global warming, and that global warming is doing exactly that, making planet Earth unlivable. That's a very serious matter. The name of the crisis has been changed a lot, but the charge remains the same. We are destroying planet Earth. No matter what they call it, the entire basis of the crisis, as they see it, is this: the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere from the exhaust of our cars and airplanes, our power plants, our factories, everything that burns fossil fuels. This is it. Their entire scientific case is built on the greenhouse effect, that they say skyrockets from the increasing amount of CO2, carbon dioxide, in the atmosphere. Now let me make something very clear, here and now. If they were correct, in fact, if there was any reasonable chance that they were on target, I would devote the balance of my life to working to stop the emission of carbon dioxide into the air. But I have seriously studied years of solid science and engineering and hard work by all those before us. The global warming crowd wants to shut down our automobiles. No more taking the kids to school in the SUV. And they want to ground our airplanes. No more flights to Hawaii. And they want to shut down the factories that make our computers and our iPods and our iPhones and all that other neat stuff that makes life good. I do not want to turn off our fossil fuel-powered civilization to save us from the global warming crisis, and here is why. There is no crisis. But let me add, I am for clean alternate energy. I wish I had better news about that. The truth, and so they say that I am just a Republican, that I'm picking on their hero Al Gore, and that undoubtedly I'm on the payroll of big oil. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friend, my interest is not political. I am not being paid by big oil or anybody else to campaign against this global warming frenzy. I'm just a long-time meteorologist, and I am very upset about my science being destroyed by a myth. I'm upset in response to these totally false scientific claims. The global warming advocates are trying to turn off the lights on our civilization, an advanced way of life that's the product of 2000. The science behind their claims, and I find their claims to be entirely wrong. I am totally convinced that there is no significant man-made global warming. This is an amazing and very upsetting case of science gone bad. How can something like this happen? Well, I'm going to try to explain it as clearly and completely as I can. But here's where all of this gets really messy. Environmentalists and politicians have adopted the global warming frenzy to advance their agendas, and they use it to promote their solutions to global warming, alternate energy, and a change to a less industrialized civilization.